Dear students, dear faculty members and guests of the university, my name is Andrei Baikov. I'm Vice Rector in charge of International Partnerships, and you haven't come here to see me. It's my great pleasure and honor to be standing up here to introduce the person who doesn't really need an introduction for anyone studying international relations, but for those of you who decided to come here just out of curiosity, I'll still do this. So I'm here to introduce Martha Finnemore, who is University Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington. Her research focuses on global governance, international organizations, ethics, and social theory. She's best known for her award-winning books like National Interest and International Society, which is on the curriculum of the Theory of International Relations at our undergraduate program, The Purpose of Intervention, Rules for the World. All these works have helped to pioneer constructivism as a new paradigm and a new tradition in the theory of international relations. In 2009, a survey of over 2,700 international relations faculty in 10 countries named her one of the 25 most influential scholars in this discipline, and one of the 5 scholars whose work in the last 5 years has been the most interesting. In 2011, she was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Finnemore completed her BA at Harvard, followed by an MA from the University of Sydney and a PhD in 1991 from Stanford, which she did under the supervision of Stephen Krasner. Her articles have appeared in International Organization, World Politics, Annual Review of Political Science, Review of International Studies, and other top-ranked international relations journal. She has been a visiting research fellow at the Brookings Institution and Stanford University. On a more personal note, I must add that my first encounter with Professor Finnemore took place 11 years ago, when I was a visiting scholar at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And then, my value scale was completely turned upside down when I discovered with what ease and eagerness Professor Finnemore was ready to meet with me several times to help along with my research, and how she subsequently continued to remain in correspondence with me, meticulously answering some of my naive and sometimes outright dumb questions over the years. I also admire her for the writing style. The way she chooses and is able to talk about pioneering unconventional truths is so accessible and pleasant to read that I took her books away to my beach holidays to read, so engaging and entertaining this was a read. Finally, I'm infinitely grateful to Professor Finnemore for accepting our invitation to visit for the first time Russia and to deliver a course of 3 lectures for our students. This is the first lecture in the series, with the other 2 to take place on Wednesday and Thursday. Thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in welcoming Professor Finnemore.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. I think you are slating your own intellectual interest. I enjoyed very much our conversations when you appeared in my office and introduced yourself. And thanks to Migimo for hosting this lovely event. I'm delighted to be here. So my talk today, as Professor Baikov said, is about constructivist theory in international relations. Constructivism is one of the most popular theoretical tools that we have in the field today. According to this same survey data that Professor Baikov mentioned, there are more IR scholars now who identify themselves as constructivists than realists, liberals, Marxists, critical theorists, or other kinds of paradigms. So I think it's worth getting to know this line of theory and worth acquainting yourself with what it might offer you as researchers, what kinds of questions it can help you answer. So constructivism emerged on the international relations scholarship scene in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, just as the Cold War was ending. None of the dominant international relations theories of the time, and certainly none of the international relations theories that I was trained in, predicted the end of the Cold War. Everybody was surprised in the academy. None of them could explain it even after the fact. They had no good theoretical explanations for the end of the Cold War, which was the biggest event in IR theory of my lifetime, I hope. I hope that nothing bad happens. So, and it wasn't just the end of the Cold War. These theories had trouble explaining all kinds of pressing 21st century problems. They cannot explain the rise of radical Islam and terrorism. They're not very good at civil wars. Civil wars are now much more frequent than interstate wars, but if your unit of analysis is the state, sub-state conflict is theoretically problematic for you. They're not very good at financial crises and economic collapse and panic like we saw in 2007 and 2008. So there's been broad interest in finding different theories, different theoretical tools that can help us explain the world that we're living in. Where could you look? The conventional theories like realism and liberalism had connected themselves to economics and rational choice as the theoretical underpinnings. That's the kind of theory they used to develop explanations and predictions. Those weren't going so well. It was a good time to look farther afield, and many of us turned to sociology and to social psychology, looking for ways to understand the politics we were seeing. So the roots of constructivism lie in those two fields, in sociology and social psychology. So what I want to do today is give a quick overview of constructivism, lay out some basic elements of constructivist analysis, and along the way, I'll try to connect this with and compare this with realist and rational choice theories, just to make clear what's different between the two lines of theory. Then I'll provide a couple of examples of how could you use this in your own research? What kind of question could you answer with constructivism that realism or another theory might have difficulty with? So, big picture. At its core, constructivism is about ideas, and particularly it's about shared ideas. Ideas that we share as people, as citizens, as states, and how those ideas shape politics in different kinds of ways. One early constructivist scholar, a fellow named John Ruggie, put it this way. He said, constructivism is about the role of human consciousness in international life. It's about our ideas about the world and how those ideas actually reshape the world we live in, how ideas can create new kinds of politics and can create change in politics. So constructivists would say studying people and politics is not like studying atoms in physics. We're not that kind of science. It's not like studying billiard balls on Kenneth Waltz's billiard table. What we do is a different kind of science. It is truly a social science because it studies social relations. People are self-aware. People, as objects of study, they reflect on, they think about what they do as they live their lives, make their choices, and move through the world. They learn from their actions over time, and people care about what other people think of them. They care about other people judging them. People are social in a way that atoms are not social and billiard balls are not social. And realist and rational choice theories do not capture those social relationships and that reflexivity, that self-reflection and awareness that's at the center of the human experience. But constructivism dives directly into those kinds of problems and is very much concerned with those social relations. It is not uniquely a theory of international politics. It is a broad social theory. And in this sense, it's like rational choice. Rational choice, you can apply to anything. You can apply it to firms. You could apply it to people. It just assumes that rational actors with fixed preferences are making instrumental choices. Constructivism is similar. It is a broad social theory. You can apply it to your family. You could apply it to the United Nations. It's a broad social theory that scholars in international relations are harnessing to explain international politics in particular. So as a social theory, as opposed to just an IR theory, constructivism is more like rational choice than it is like realism, and it provides a broad notion about how does the world work. And specifically, it focuses on two things. Social theories of all kinds, rational choice, constructivism, tell us first how agents or actors in the world, the actors might be states, the actors might be people, how those actors or agents are related to big social structures. How do they relate to, for example, the international system as a big structure? And the move that constructivists make that's very different from these economics-based theories is constructivists see agents, the actors, and big structures as mutually constituted. And that's complicated, so let me spin that out for a minute. States and the people in them, our agents, create social structures. So this is obvious in some ways. Where do states come from? People create them. We have in the United States founding fathers, George Washington and all those guys. And they founded this, you have czars, they found the state. People create states, but the process also works in reverse. That big social structures, once they're in place, exercise influence and shape the agents. They shape the people. They shape the states that are embedded in the social structures. So the institutions of society shapes who we are. It shapes what we want. It shapes what we do. So the core of constructivism is the claim that the political world we live in is one that, on the one hand, we ourselves have made, but also the world continues to shape us and remake us, changing what we want, changing how we behave, changing how we see ourselves as actors in it. So society and our environment shape what we want, who we think we are, what we value, but we have agency. We can change society. We can change politics. We can change social structures. The seminal article on this is Alex Wentz's piece on the agent structure debate that again draws on this sociology literature. It came out in the late 1980s, an international organization, and lays this out in a very nice, clear way. And that article changed the thinking of a large number of scholars, especially young scholars. I was a first-year graduate student when this came out, so it had a big effect. And since that time, this group has been trying to unpack this mutual constitution process and understand how it plays out in international relations. So this enterprise of understanding how actors create structures and structures shape actors is very, very different from rational choice and realist-based theories in IR. Those theories make very different assumptions about agents and structures and how the world is put together. Rational choice theories and realism assume some static, fixed set of actors, for example, states. Those actors have static, fixed preferences. All states want security, all states want wealth, whatever you think states want. And those agents and structures, those states and their preferences, are in a fixed environment, a fixed social structure that they call anarchy. So these realist and rationalist scholars assume they know who the important actors are. It's assumption of the theory. They assume they know what the actors want. It's an assumption of the theory. And they assume that the actors themselves are aware of that and know what they want and agree, in fact, with the analysts. And they're assuming that all of these actors are using an instrumental means-ends kind of logic to make their decisions about how they behave in the world. So they're assuming a fixed set of actors acting instrumentally in pursuit of fixed and known preferences in a condition of anarchy. That's, in a realist world, what gives us the politics we see. And with all those assumptions, realists can generate all kinds of testable hypotheses and theories about how politics works. This can be useful It can be very useful, and some of my best friends are realists. I love them dearly. But this is also, I would argue, very limited. Constructivists have a much broader and, I would say, deeper view of politics. Constructivists want to ask questions about many of the things that rational choice-based theories just assume. For example, constructivists want to know where preferences and national interests come from. Other theories assume states know what they want. But do they? Do states know what they want? I mean, I live in Washington. Much of the debate in that city, much of the time, is about exactly this question. What would be good for the United States? What are US interests in this region or that conflict? So is China our friend? Do we want, or is China our enemy? Do we want more open trade with China? Do we want a trade war with China? An assumption that and the answer to that is the United States government doesn't know. I mean, this would be my view. We are fighting about this endlessly. And the Congress does not agree with the president. It's a mess. But the assumption that US preferences then are fixed and that the US knows what it wants in some clear, unproblematic way just seems implausible to me. I mean, when I live in Washington, it is implausible to me that this government always knows what it wants because it's fighting about it all the time. So what constructivists would do is turn the assumption about what states want into a research question, something we scholars can investigate. We would ask, how do states come to know what they want? How do they understand their interests? And how do those interests change over time? A lot of constructivist research takes this form. It asks questions about things that these other theories take for granted, treat as assumptions. So one other important feature of constructivism is that it's dynamic. Constructivism is about change. Mutual constitution, where agents shape structures and structures shape agents, that's a process. It's a dynamic process. It's a process of change. And constructivists are very, very interested in how change happens in world politics. I mean, realism and rational choice, I think, have a very different approach to this. Those models often emphasize equilibrium. For many of the game theoretic models that were popularized by realists, for example, and some of the economic liberals, emphasize equilibrium. That might be a fine thing if you think the world is a static, stable place. If you think the world is in equilibrium, a theory that assumes equilibrium might be a fine theory to have. Constructivists tend to think that most of the world, most of the time, is not in equilibrium. Most of the world, most of the time, is changing. So constructivist theory is better suited to deal with change, and therefore more interesting and attractive for us than these equilibrium static theories, because we don't think the world looks that way. So how do constructivists go about doing their research? This is a very big question. I have very small time, so let me introduce three big concepts that constructivists find useful. Concept number one would be social facts. This comes out of Durkheim, for those of you who are interested in social theory. And the definition of a social fact is a shared idea that shapes our perceptions of what's real and shapes and constrains us as we move through society. The classic example of a social fact is money. Money is a social fact in this sense. Those paper rubles that you have in your wallet have no value in themselves, right? The bits of paper, you can't do anything with those. You can't eat them. You can't, you could build a very small fire with them. You can't do anything useful with them. The pieces of paper only are useful if other people think they have value. It's the fact that we share a belief, share the idea that these little pieces of paper are valuable. That means I can go in and hand the shopkeeper a piece of paper and get a sandwich. Or I can hand someone some pieces of paper and get a ticket to Moscow. Know that I can convert the little piece of paper into something useful only happens because we all share this idea about money. And you can see this too in politics. When people stop believing in the value of money, what happens? When people stop believing that the paper has value, you get economic collapse. You get hyperinflation. You get the Great Depression in the Weimar Republic and all the rest of it. So money is a classic example of this. Another example that's very prominent for international relations scholars is rights. Rights only exist in the social world if we all believe they exist, if they become embedded in institutions, embedded in law, embedded in culture. Rights aren't a physical thing. They are a shared belief, and they're politically powerful. They fuel revolutions of many kinds. They constrain state governments in the way they treat their citizens. But they have no material reality. They exist because people share a belief that, yes, there is a right to this thing. So moving more quickly, concept number 2 and concept number 3 are about agents and about structures. Concept number 2, identities and preferences. How do I know as an actor what I want? How I know that depends on who I think I am, my identity. Am I a democracy? Is that my identity? If I'm a democracy, then I want elections, I want freedom of the press, and all the stuff that goes with democracy. Am I protector of the free world? Do I think that's my identity? Well, then I need to help ensure my preferences would be, my interests would be to make sure that those free elections and freedom of the press exist in other people's countries, which may or may not be a good idea, but that was what the identity would want. So where your preferences come from and how identities change over time, those attributes of actors and agents, this interests constructivists very much. This is a big part of constructivist research, and there's lots written about this. The third big concept I would put out there has to do with the structure side of this agent-structure relationship. And I'll call this a bucket of things. These are the social structures that shape agents, and the 3 big ones that have interested constructivists are institutions, norms, and rules. So the insight here is that these social structures, these institutions, norms, and rules are powerful. They shape what people want. They can shape what states want over time. And much of my own work has been about looking specifically, my own interest is in these international organizations, like the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. These are big international organizations. Over time, big structures can shape what their member states want and what individual people want. One example that a good colleague has written a book about is the way the European community, later the European Union, has been successful at this. When Europe was created as a project in the 50s after the war, there were no Europeans. And the way policymakers posed their challenge was this: how do we create Europe without Europeans? Everyone thinks they're French or German or Italian. They don't think they're European. But they've been working at this now for 70 years, and they are slowly over time developing an identity. People in Western Europe, especially young people, actually think of themselves as European. That's meaningful to them in politically consequential ways. And there's interesting research on how that came to be. So, what would you do with this? How could constructivism be useful? What can constructivism do for you? The kinds of questions I can answer with these constructivist frameworks, I would argue, are quite different from the kind of questions that realists would address. And let me give you two examples of the kinds of questions that constructivists can tackle and would be interested in, and try to explain as I present them why this is puzzling for realists, why they don't have great explanations of these kinds of events. So the first case study I would offer you is about the origins of the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. So there's a puzzle here. All good research starts with a puzzle, a question, something I don't know and I need to understand. And the question here flows out of the following logic. In war, above all other situations, we should be able to treat states as actors and soldiers as self-interested, rational utility maximizers, simply because in war, the most basic interest, survival, not getting killed, is at stake. People don't mess around when they think they're in danger of getting killed. They're going to be logical and ruthlessly rational. But in fact, when you look at the institution of war, it's a very social institution that has elaborate social rules going back hundreds or thousands of years. You know, think about chivalry in the medieval knights and codes of the warrior in all kinds of different societies that might be very far from here. War is a social institution that has always been highly regulated with deep rules and notions of honor and notions of glory. And in contemporary life, we have embodied those rules in something called the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions specify a whole variety of protections for wounded soldiers on the battlefield, for medical personnel who come to care for those soldiers, and for civilians, non-combatants who are also involved in the war. It requires states to protect not just their own wounded soldiers, but enemy wounded soldiers. This is one of the most widely signed and accepted agreements in the interstate system. Every state is a member of the Geneva Conventions, but it puts a limit on the core sovereign prerogative. What is the most basic prerogative, the most basic right of a state? It's its ability to make war, the monopoly on violence. And this says to states, you cannot do just anything you want. You cannot use your violence any way you want. There are rules. You can only hurt and shoot some people. You cannot hurt and shoot wounded soldiers, civilians, and military people. Why would states sign such a thing? Where did this come from? Where did this social structure, this set of, it's now international law, norms, and rules, come from? There are agents creating this social structure. There are agents creating this Geneva Convention. And in this case, it's an agent that realists would say should be totally unimportant. It's a small, non-governmental organization based in Geneva that we now call the International Committee of the Red Cross. A realist would expect a whole handful of Swiss guys, they're all Swiss, I think they're still all Swiss, to have no power. They have no guns, they have nothing. But they have created and promoted the ideas of humanitarian protection for civilians and wounded soldiers. And they have persuaded states that these were good ideas to adopt. You know, so how does this happen? How did the agents persuade all these states? I mean, there's a long story about this, so I'm going to condense the story because I don't have so much time. But there is a guy, one guy. His name is Henri Dunant, or he's Henry Dunant if you speak English, but if you're French, he's Henri Dunant. He's a Swiss banker from Geneva. And he was in the town of Castiglione in 1859 when the big battle of Solferino happens. And all the wounded are coming into his town. Soldiers are dying in the streets, and they're left to die there. Why are they left to die there? Why doesn't someone take them into their house? The civilians don't want to take in the wounded soldiers. If I take in an Austrian soldier and the French army comes, I get shot. I'm a collaborator. If I do it the other way around, if I take in a French soldier and the Austrian army comes, I get shot. So I leave them in the street and just let them die. So Dunant saw this happening and had an idea. Ideas are important. He wrote a book, and the book was a very smart book. It has a first section that is this very lively and fun account of his what he saw on the battlefield that everybody wanted to read because it was so entertaining. But the second part was a policy proposal that said two things should happen. All states should do two things. All states should set up national aid societies that would follow the army around and provide medical attention and supplies to treat the wounded. And all states should sign a treaty that would recognize these relief societies and treat them as neutrals, not target them, not hurt them, and make them outside of combat. So he has this book becomes the toast of the salons of Europe, and he targets his proposal, his persuasion initiatives to military doctors. When he convenes the conference, he doesn't want to talk to army generals because he thinks he'll get dismissed. He instead approaches the doctors in the military because the doctors have a duty, their identity is to save life. That's what they want to do. The doctors want to protect the war wounded. So the doctors are his entry point for this persuasion effort to get states to change their mind, to get them to respect these protections for these new relief societies, which every state has. There is the American Red Cross. I assume there's a Russian Red Cross. There's a Turkish Red Crescent. Every country now has these. So every country is a signatory to this, and by the time you get to the 21st century, this is a very elaborated set of institutions, a very elaborated set of laws. So what makes this a particularly constructivist line of research? Three things. It's about ideas. It's about changing people's minds, changing their interests, their ideas about what they want. And in this case, it's changing states' ideas about what they want. Rational choice doesn't tell you very much about that. Neither does realism. Preferences, number two, preferences are not fixed, as they would be in other theories. Prior to the Red Cross and the efforts of Henri Dunant and his friends, states had no idea they cared about the wounded or protecting civilians. The idea came from these civilian actors, this NGO, that persuaded states this was a good thing to do. And three, this is about the creation of new social facts, new things that now in the 21st century we just treat as reality, part of the landscape, fact of life. And the facts it creates are rights, rights for the war wounded, rights for civilians to be protected. It doesn't mean that no rights get respected all the time. That's true in domestic politics, it's true in international politics. There are always violations, but now there is a widespread understanding of what good behavior looks like. And conversely, this is what makes clear what a violation looks like when it happens. And where does that come from? It comes from this small, powerless NGO and its ideas. Another very quick example would be economic development. This is a huge international activity. Billions of dollars, thousands of people from every country are involved in development work around the world. And realists take for granted, I think, that economic development is a goal of states. It's an assumption of the theory. States want wealth, so of course states want development. Constructivists are more curious about this, and they would ask different kinds of research questions about things other theories just assume. For example, constructivists would say, what is development exactly? Develop into what? What are the goals of development? How do you know when you get there? How do you know when you're developed? And they would also ask, where did development as a task for states come from? When did states start doing development? And particularly, when did they start doing it for other countries in other countries? George Washington and the czars did not have ministers of development and were not out there doing development in other countries. Where does this big international activity come from? Well, historically, the place that has had to wrestle with questions of development is, again, an international organization. It's not a state. Our understanding of what development is and how that changes is at the World Bank. And it's the staff of the bank that make a lot of the decisions about how we, as an international collection of people and states, what we think we're doing when we do this development. The understandings that the bank has have changed over time. In the early years of the bank, the goal of development was understood to be rising national GNP. It was the goal of the bank, the goal of development was to make states richer. Where the money goes inside the states, not the bank's problem. And in fact, the bank is probably barred from interfering with what happens inside states because that would be a sovereign prerogative. Governments get to determine how to distribute wealth. And the way they raised money to do this was lending. The bank will lend for big hydroelectric dams and roads and other things. Those projects produce money. You can sell the electricity from the hydroelectric dam, and then you repay the loan to the bank. The bank was a bank in a very bank-like way. And the early heads of the bank were all trained as bankers. That's what they knew how to do. They were put in charge of the World Bank because they had been bankers in their previous life. This changes in the 1960s. There's a new head of the World Bank, a fellow named Robert McNamara. He was not a banker. He did not share those ideas of the bank. He was a manager. He ran Ford Motor Company before he came to the World Bank. And after he ran Ford Motor Company, he was Secretary of Defense for the Vietnam War, which was not going very well, so they pulled him out of the Secretary of Defense and put him in the World Bank. So he was a very different kind of thinker, and he had a very different idea about development. He said, no, it's not about making states richer, it's about making individual people richer. The World Bank's goal should be to reduce global poverty. This is not the goal that the founders of the bank put out. The founders of the bank did not think this was what development was about. But McNamara decides this is how it's going to be going forward, and he is able to bring into the bank a whole cadre of economists who developed the intellectual architecture for understanding how we could do this and why it's a good economic idea. The major shareholders of the bank were not pushing for this. They were not interested in this. But again, economists in national governments bought into these ideas. They made economic sense to the economists. So as conversations from one economist to another took place, the bank was able to persuade national governments that they should be doing this poverty alleviation project rather than the banking they had been doing before. And this sticks. This is what the bank does now. If you go to the World Bank website, what does it say? A world free from poverty. That is their goal. And this spreads as well. It's not just the bank now. If you go to the United Nations website, 17 sustainable development goals for all the members of the United Nations. And what's goal number 1? Zero poverty by 2030. So there's still this idea that we should alleviate poverty in other countries, continues to be this widespread national interest of states. So like the Geneva Convention's case, this is very much a constructivist project that looks very different from the way a realist would choose a topic or carry out research. This is about changing ideas and how changed ideas change policy. So it asks, how did we come to understand that reducing poverty around the world and reducing the poverty of other states' citizens, how did that come to be in the national interest of the United States, of Russia, of the G7, of the European Union, the big rich countries? Why should they care about poor people in poor countries? But they do, and they send big money to these places. You can trace the history of this back to the origins of new development thinking at the World Bank. Conventional international relations theory, I think, and rational choice certainly would have trouble explaining how that transformation, that change in thinking, in ideas, goals, and preferences, how that happened. They don't have a good theory for this. But constructivism is trying to understand exactly those questions. It's questions like how interests change, how goals change, how the world becomes a different kind of place, and how individual actors can make that happen, how Henri Dunant or Robert McNamara, how their ideas can get connected to big organizations and change state policy in sweeping ways. So for constructivists, politics isn't just about actors pursuing interests. Much of politics is about actors trying to transform and change interests of other states in ways that realist theory, rational choice theory, doesn't give us a lot of room to think about. But for constructivists, this is what we do. This is the kind of research that excites us. These are the kinds of questions that interest us. So thank you all very much for listening. And